everyone, and welcome back to Generation Cult, an interview show about people who grew up in high-demand authoritarian groups, also known as cults, and how they acclimated to mainstream society after they left their groups. I'm Dhyana Levy.
And I'm Ashlen Hilliard.
And today we're speaking with Chris Shelton, who grew up in Scientology. He now hosts the YouTube channel and podcast Sensibly Speaking, and he recently got his graduate degree in the Psychology of Coercive Control, which also makes him a former classmate of mine and Ashlen. Yes, we recently all just went to school together, and we'll talk more about that later.
Yay! So my name is Chris Shelton, and I was raised as a Scientologist. So I grew up as a sort of second-generation Scientology member. Not only did I grow up around the belief set of that and in that culture, but when I graduated high school, they recruited me to start working for the church as like a full professional staff member. And I did that for 8 years. And then I decided that I wasn't dedicated enough, and I joined what's called the Sea Organization, which is kind of like the most fanatical, hardcore group of Scientologists in the world. There's about 4,000 of them. And I worked for another 17 years doing that. That was a full-time sort of 24/7, 7 days a week kind of thing. And I finally got out and escaped from that whole situation in 2013. And since then, I have started a YouTube channel. I have written a book about Scientology. I have consulted and been on TV shows about it. I was in Leah Remini's series, which was really awesome. And I have started a podcast. And then most recently, I guess 2 years ago now, we all got onto that program of the Psychology of Coercive Control. And I actually pursued and got a master's degree in the Psychology of Coercive Control. And so now I understand it at a research level, at an actual, kind of academic level. And that's kind of basically been my life since I escaped.
Well, thanks for being here and for talking to us about it. So yeah, let's start with your early years. How many years would you say you spent of your life in Scientology?
Well, my parents got involved when I was about 4 years old, and I didn't get out until I was 42.
Wow.
So,
Oh, wow.
so yeah, quite a few years, and 27 of those years actually working for Scientology, or 25 years working for Scientology.
Wow.
Wow. That's a lot of
Yeah,
time.
long time. Yeah.
So how did your family get involved, going back even farther? Like, how did they start it?
It was interesting because my parents had actually gotten divorced when I was about 2. They were not getting along. And my father's brother, my uncle, had gotten involved with Scientology. And this is the early 1970s, right? This is way before any concept of the internet or exposure of the abuses and all that. Nobody knew anything about it.
Yeah.
And so, my dad did this communications class that they offer. And this was their number one way of getting new members in the 1970s, was through these courses. And my dad was so enthralled by it, was so enthusiastic about the things that he learned about communication. He goes and taught, and my mom and he have joint custody of me. So they're still in touch with each other and sharing, me. So he's talking to her. He convinces her to come in and find out about Scientology. She does a communications class, and they then get some marriage counseling or something like that, I guess, happened. And they got back together.
Wow. That's significant.
And it appeared to be a real success story. They did fine by us. I had a younger brother that we adopted as well, and we were not abused. It was not a physically abusive environment or anything like that. But the Scientology influence growing up was heavy, and it was intense, and it was constant. And so where other people grow up with maybe a more extreme version of Jesus, I grew up with an extreme version of this guy called L. Ron Hubbard. And, this was this genius humanitarian figure, and that's how he was always presented. And so I had a pretty skewed view of reality from that whole thing. But that's how my parents basically got involved. And they did not themselves get out of Scientology until they had spent many, many hundreds of thousands of dollars and many, many years of dedication and loyalty to that group. They even worked for Scientology for a little while. And it wasn't until I was had moved away from home that they got divorced again and got out of Scientology.
Would you say that being in Scientology affected your relationship with your family significantly?
Yes, absolutely. It was a major influence in every aspect of my life growing up.
And what did you think of that? Did you enjoy it? Did you have questions early on? Like what were you thinking during that time?
Well, my feelings changed over time because initially it was just something that I was taught, and there were concepts and techniques and methods and things that, because it's a very practical kind of thing. There's a lot of stuff you do with Scientology in your life. It's not just a belief set. So there were all these things I was doing growing up, and it being a destructive extremist group, these were things that were done to the point where they were uncomfortable or even, kind of abusive. There's a principle, for example, in Scientology that when you study something, it's very, 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 very important that you never go past any words that you don't fully understand. And Scientologists are kind of married to dictionaries for that reason. They're always looking up words. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with understanding words. But the way you have to do it, when I was 7 years old and my mom is forcing my nose in a dictionary every time I ask any question at all, it got kind of abusive. It kind of be like, well, can't you just answer my question, Mom? And it's like, no, you gotta look it up in the dictionaries, and it doesn't sound like this big thing, but if you saw me in tears, like just like, Mom, it was really bad.
Like, this is thought reform in action.
Yeah.
These are the little things that build and create this narrative. It's fascinating that you mentioned the communication aspect.
Mm-hmm.
Like the church used sort of this communication course, because at the root of thought reform, it's communication principles, practices, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like what lens can we get adherents to see through our worldview? So I think that's really interesting when you mentioned that dictionary story, like how that's thought reform in action. And it doesn't seem like you said it seems outrageous, but it also doesn't. It's like just read this dictionary, but it really can be used as a means of control to sort of paint this worldview through this specific lens. So
You're absolutely right in pointing that out. Because when you describe these things, it's very easy for somebody listening to this from the outside to sort of blow it off or go, well, that doesn't sound like a big deal. And it's hard to paint the full picture of it, but language is everything when it comes to the
everything.
control
Yeah.
that Scientology and destructive cults in general exert over people, right? This whole loaded language concept. But also just the use of authoritarian kind of methods that are disguised as help. And for a kid, they're either being helped or they're not. There's not a vested interest in the agenda of Scientology. It's either you're helping me or you're not. And I was not being helped by this as a kid, yet I kept having it forced on me and told, this is helpful. This is useful. This is how you're supposed to get along in life. But when your parents and all of your parents' friends, by the way, which means all of their kids, right, who are your friends, are all part of this culture, then it becomes this sort of self-reinforcing kind of thing. You're constantly having these messages reinforced that Scientology's good and L. Ron Hubbard is a genius. And as I got older, the other concepts that started being introduced to me included past lives and a spiritual existence that transcends the body, and the idea that because we've lived before, that there have been civilizations that are an awful lot like Star Wars. Like Star Wars is actually real. And Scientologists eat that up because they think in their past lives that's exactly what we were all up to.
Well, and as a kid, Chris, like when you would watch those films, did you recognize like this isn't reality, or did that make you feel elated that that could be reality?
Oh, it was very, very empowering. And that's the trick, right, with this stuff is you present people with fantastical levels of information, convince them or give them a good reason to think that it's true, and suddenly this person feels empowered with sacred knowledge or special information, right? But when I was 9 years old, I didn't know that. And when your dad is the one telling you this stuff, that there are stations on Venus and Mars that are keeping an eye on Earth.
Yeah.
You know, when you're 9 years old and your dad's telling you this, it's like, wow, right? And it very, very much distorts your view of reality, because suddenly science and engineering and astrophysics and these fields where very, very smart people have dedicated their lives to figuring out the actual answers to questions we have in these fields, and you just deny all of that. You just go, well, none of them know what they're talking about because L. Ron Hubbard said blah 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 blah, right? And to my 9-year-old ears, that all made sense. And so, you know, so how does this influence a kid? Well, then you go to high school and you're trying to learn science, but you're denying half of it in your head because you're thinking these guys are out to lunch. L. Ron Hubbard figured it all out already.
I'm kind of assuming people listening to this are familiar with Scientology, but just in case they're not, is there any way to briefly describe L. Ron Hubbard and basically what Scientology wants you
Oh,
to
of
believe?
course. Scientology is a money-making scam. It's not a legitimate religious movement or enterprise. That being said, the dogma or the belief or the idea with Scientology is that it's a path to spiritual freedom and personal immortality, and a kind of godhood for each of its members. Supposedly, the belief set is that you are an immortal spiritual being. You are not your body. You never have been your body. Your body is just something you occupy. And you have occupied millions and millions of bodies through the millennia because you have lived spiritually for a nearly infinite amount of time. And we've been bumping around, having adventures and different bodies and different experiences on other planets and Earth for all these years. And through those experiences, you have accumulated an incredible amount of trauma and stress. So the idea is that all this trauma has created a kind of amnesia where you are not able to remember your past lives. And the reason you can't remember them isn't because they didn't happen, it's because you've kind of chosen to forget them because of all that pain. Who would want to remember all that crap, right? So Scientology offers a route, a set of procedures called auditing that are supposed to help you recover those memories, remember all the crap that happened to you, get rid of it, erase it, make it go away so that trauma kind of never really happened. And through that process, you are supposed to rejuvenate or revitalize your spiritual abilities that are inherent in you right now.
And I'd
that's
also
why
like
they
to
pay so much
mention
money.
that L. Ron Hubbard comes from a science fiction writing background, right? I always like to mention that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Let's talk about L. Ron Hubbard for a minute. So, L. Ron Hubbard was born in 1911, and he was a writer. He was a prolific writer of all genres. He did everything because he was a pulp fiction writer. He wrote in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and he had very, very grandiose ideas of his own value and worth to him, you know, to society and all of that. He thought he was the bee's knees. What ended up happening was after the war, after World War II, he was a bit of a failed officer and tried to captain vessels and tried to have a career as a Navy guy, but he kept screwing up. And he got his command taken away from him. And at the end of the war, he was kind of puttering around in Southern California, trying to figure out what to do with himself. And he ended up getting into the occult. And that led to him developing, in a very roundabout fashion. These are not all cause effect things, but basically by 1950, he had come up with a scheme where he would use hypnotism, which is something he knew how to do, in order to effect what looked like therapeutic psychological results and improvements. He would use hypnotism to bring this about. And he called this Dianetics. And he wrote a book. And he put this into a form where people could read the book, and it took off.
When you were actually in, how much of this did you know? How much of this was kept from
Mm.
members? Was this something you found out later?
Oh, none of it. None of it. Yes, none of this is apparent to Scientologists. They are fed a fake biography of L. Ron Hubbard. He claimed, and Scientologists believe this, that he was blinded and crippled after the war because of injuries he sustained. And he engaged, he said, in a year-long study of cellular biology and psychology and therapy. And he figured out on his own this Dianetics process, and he cured himself of his bad eyesight and his bad back and his inability to walk. None of that is true. But you'd have to actually go look up his war records to find that out. And nobody bothered to do that because back in 1950, you could get away with saying stuff like this. And he did. And people bought into it. And it was a runaway bestseller. And L. Ron Hubbard was suddenly overnight a nationwide sensation. It was a fad. People ate this up. All through 1950, Dianetics was a big deal. But at the end of the day, it's all built on a lie. And so Dianetics didn't, it took off and then it failed. But anyway, from that, out of the ashes of that Dianetics meltdown, he created the Church of Scientology. And one of the reasons that he did that was because Dianetics was making very, very inflated claims about not only being able to make you feel better and handle your trauma, which he had his own language for, he called them engrams, but he was claiming that you could cure cancer with this, that you could cure bad eyesight, that you could cure all kinds of physical problems with Dianetics. And of course, those are medical claims. And so he decided to make it a religion, because when it's a religion, now it's not science anymore. Now it's faith. And now you can get away with saying almost anything you want. And that was how it converted over from a science called Dianetics to a religion called Scientology.
And so you were, as long as you can remember as a child, this is what you were raised with L. Ron Hubbard.
Oh
is
yeah,
the
my
best.
my whole system of morality was centered around L. Ron Hubbard's idea of ethics.
How isolated were you? I mean, it sounds like you were around other people who weren't Scientologists. So do you feel like any of the outside world kind of got into your consciousness, or were you just focused on Scientology?
No, it's a great question, because what happened was every time the real world would encroach on my Scientology beliefs, I would learn that I had to clam up. I had to self-isolate, because in public school, of course, if you bring this kind of stuff up, people are rightly going to ridicule some of these ideas. So I learned to just kind of shut up and not talk about this too much with my non-Scientology friends and stuff. But I didn't really have very many non-Scientology friends either. So it was kind of an interesting little self-encapsulated bubble world. And because I got recruited into Scientology as a staff member after high school, I kind of went in the direction of really immersing myself in that world even harder. And I did so because I believed, and was told repeatedly by my parents and by other authority figures in the church, that Scientology was the only thing that was going to possibly make a positive difference in the world.
So you graduated high school, and then after that, you went into Scientology as a staff member. So tell me about that. What did you do for Scientology during all those years?
Oh yeah, I got, okay, so this was in Santa Barbara, California. And I would go down to Santa Barbara before I joined staff, I was taking classes. I did classes in communication. I did classes in how to study. I did classes on how to use that e-meter that they have, the little electronic device that they use.
Yeah.
And I was doing these kind of classes still as a student going to high school. Once I graduated, they sat me down and said, "Hey man, we want you to work here. You're awesome. You're amazing. You're the best person ever." They love bomb the hell out of me, right? And I was like 17 years old, and I was very naive. I mean, my worldview had been completely filtered by Scientology. And I was told over and over and over again that this was the only way to make a difference in the world. So when I joined staff, basically what they did is they trained me how to be a teacher, and I supervised the classwork that got done by all the Scientologists in Santa Barbara. They would come to the church on a regular basis, just like I had, and they would do classes. And I supervised those classes and made sure that they had dictionaries, that they were looking up their words, right, that they didn't understand, because that's the key to studying Scientology. So I had gone from a kid who was abused by dictionaries to abusing other people with dictionaries. It's
And
pretty
you're
sad,
talking
right?
about Scientology's own dictionary. Like Scientology had its own dictionary separate from Webster's, right?
It has two of its own dictionaries.
Oh my goodness. One wasn't enough.
Yeah, one was not enough. And after about 4 or 5 years of that, I was bumped up and promoted to becoming the person who was overseeing not only the classwork, but also the auditing, their version of counseling. And so now I was an executive in the Church of Scientology. And from that position, I kept working in Santa Barbara for another like 2 or 3 years until 1995. And that's when I moved down to LA and joined up with what's called the C organization. And that was a whole nother level of commitment to Scientology.
Yeah, I heard that's very intense if you join the Sea Org.
Yes.
How long were you a Sea Org member?
17 years.
Wow.
That's a long time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's the group. The Sea Org are the guys who sign the billion-year contract.
I can only imagine when that is impressioned on you from such an early age, like when you were a child, I mean, you were sort of primed to become this sort of this teacher, to join the like.
Yeah. Every single step made sense.
It sounds like you were pretty dedicated. Obviously, you joined the Sea
Very,
Org and you were a member
very.
for 17 years. So, talk to me about leaving. Like what
Yeah.
what started the unraveling process for you?
Okay, this is a great question because it actually was 10 years in the making. I mean, I can tell you about the final nail in the coffin that broke everything open at the end, but the real first doubts and reservations and problems with it came in like 2002, 2003 or so. I went down to Los Angeles and I was working in management. And I was a manager for the Western United States. I went from running one classroom and one counseling center to running all of them in the West US. And our job as managers was to goose them into production and get them getting more people in, delivering more services, making more money. It was all about getting things getting bigger and bigger and bigger and trying to get more people in. And if you didn't get your quotas met or if you didn't get the job done right, you could find yourself at 3 a.m. scrubbing pots in the galley to encourage you to do a better job. It was a very heavily disciplined environment. And the punishments were regular and they were gruesome. You know, we had demands on us like this week there's to be $1 million produced out of the Western United States. Well, you know, that's a lot of money. Good luck with that, right? We were routinely not able to make quotas that were purposefully set so high that we would never be able to make them. So after 8 years of that, I was a little burnt out. And I just went AWOL for 3 days and I went and crashed in a hotel room. And I was feeling pretty down. I was feeling pretty bad about my life choices. But at this point, 8 years in, I was married. All of my friends, my entire life was structured around the C organization and Scientology. I didn't have any other friends or connections. I had pretty much, I mean, I was borderline estranged from my family at this point because I was hardly ever having any time to talk to them, much less go see them. Days off were a fantasy. I wasn't getting days off. I was working 7 days a week, 15 to 18-hour days. And after years, that takes a toll on you. So finally I took off, came back because I couldn't leave my wife, couldn't leave my entire life. But that was the point where I started really wondering, what the hell am I doing here? What's going on? But it took another 10 years of nonsense, of ups and downs and good and bad and getting onto other jobs and being sent around. I even did a 3-year prison re-education program within the Sea organization. It's called the RPF. And that was incredibly gruesome. That was incredibly grueling. But I finished that program. Anyway, I get through all this nonsense. And here's the thing that finally broke it. After 17 years of being in the Sea Org, I got to a point where I realized that I was having to lie to people. And I was having to lie to people a lot. And it was always very rationalized. It was always very justified, right? Greatest good for greatest number. Scientology is the greatest good. So anything that forwards Scientology is inherently good. And therefore, you see how the morality gets twisted around here, right? And it suddenly hit me, oh, that's what I'm doing. I'm telling all these lies. And it's not right. It's not okay. I shouldn't be lying to people. I shouldn't have to deceive them in order to get them to do what's good. These two things don't go together very well. And that was the point where I realized I need to stop doing this. This is not right. It was a moral crisis. And that's when I basically woke up and said, okay, I need to stop working for this organization now. I still wanted to do Scientology because I thought that the abuses and the problems that I had witnessed with the organization were separate from the subject matter. All the books and lectures and everything that L. Ron Hubbard gave is its own subject matter. And so I kind of was still thinking that it was good. It was just the execution from the organization that was bad. And I got myself, it took me a year, but by 2013, by the end of 2012, I was out of the Sea Org. It took me 9 months, but I got myself out of there. And it was in 2013 that I finally got on the internet and learned all the truth.
So what was it like?
Yeah.
What was it like disentangling yourself? I mean, your whole life was Scientology. You were married to another Scientologist. Like what was it like trying to get out? It can't have been easy.
Well, no. And in fact, I had to leave that marriage. I had to leave a bunch of connections behind. And I still wanted to be a Scientologist in good standing. I didn't want to just take off and leave and be declared a suppressive person and get shunned and all of that. So I took all the actions you'd have to take in order to avoid that, only to then get on the internet and start reading stories and truth from people that I used to know who had been in the Sea Org with me and who had gotten out way before I did and come to their own truths and realizations about it and had started writing about it and on blogs and books and articles and interviews. And once I started seeing that side of the picture, it was like a floodgate opened up. It was like the dam broke, right? It was like all this information that had been denied to me suddenly was available to me.
I can only imagine.
It was incredibly overwhelming. It took about 3 months of very late nights, on my laptop, right, diving into this and that and the other thing. And I'll tell you, the moment where the break finally happened, I'll never forget it my entire life. I remember sitting in this room in my apartment, and it just suddenly, it's a really apt expression to say the light dawned, the day dawned, because it felt like that. It felt like suddenly there was a light, and I was like, oh, I have been a pawn on a chessboard. This entire time, I have been being pushed around, moved around at the whim of others who I didn't even know existed. Playing a game I didn't even know I was part of, that I was being lied to. As much as I was lying to other people, I had been being lied to 10 times more by this organization and by individuals in it in order to influence and manipulate me and thousands of other people to do their bidding without questioning what was going on. All because we're thinking we're saving the world while they know they're just taking advantage of us. And that took a very, very long time to come to peace with.
I've been told by people who leave Scientology that it's kind of okay if you keep your mouth shut. I mean, your friends and family might not talk to you, but people generally leave you alone. But problems start when you start speaking publicly about it, which you certainly do.
Yes. Yes.
talk about Scientology often. So I was hoping you could tell me more about first how you got to a place where you felt like you could speak publicly about Scientology, and how has that been?
As you can tell, I like to talk. I talk a lot, right? I'm a talker. I have been my entire life. So it's in my nature to not be quiet, and I couldn't. I was going online anonymously in 2013 when I was learning all of this stuff, and I was venting because I was pissed. And through that venting, they figured out who I was, and they busted me because I didn't really appreciate in 2013 how closely and how paranoid they are about monitoring the internet. And they do, they monitor it very closely. And so they watch for critics of Scientology. Or at least they were doing that a lot more back then. Now there's so many of us they can't really keep up. But
It's hard to keep
um,
track. Yeah.
yeah, but I decided I needed to start speaking up. And at first I was doing it anonymously, but then after I got busted and I didn't really have anything to lose anymore because the church basically kicked me out. They exiled me, I guess you could say. I was declared a suppressive person by December 2013. And that means I was out. I was gone. No Scientologist was ever going to talk to me ever again. It was over. And I lost relationships and friends and things I'd had for 20 years overnight. They were just gone. So I didn't really have anything to lose at that point. And I did have a job and I was setting up my life. And so I decided, well, I'm going to start speaking up about this and sharing what I know. And to hell with it. If they want to come after me, well, let's do it. And I started speaking up and I started a YouTube channel and I started making videos. And within, I think, about 2 or 3 years, I'd written a book. And then Leah's show happened and the Going Clear documentary happened and my channel had taken off. Yet, interestingly, I wasn't really getting a whole lot of pushback from Scientology. They never really came after me the way they did other people. And I always wondered about that until I realized what makes them come after somebody. Because they did come after me the day after I was on Leah's show.
Mm. So you have to be
So
like a certain level of public for
that's
them
right.
to
That's
do that.
right.
And what
Right.
does coming after you mean?
Yeah, what they did was the day after I appeared on Scientology in the Aftermath, there was a hate website posted about me. And by hate website, I mean it was an official Scientology website, which was trashing Leah's show. And they decided to character assassinate me as a guest of the show. So they had my now ex-wife, who's still in the Sea Org. They put her on camera and they had her rant and rave about what a horrible person I am. But the funny thing was, with Going Clear, with Scientology in the Aftermath, with all the books, with all the exposure, that website ended up becoming a badge of honor for me. Instead of being something that was actually hurting me, it actually helped me.
You reclaim that narrative. I love that.
Oh, me too. I loved
Yeah.
it. So people go and read what Scientology has to say about former members, and this is where this is one of the best ways of seeing the cult disconnect that is routine. Is they live in a bubble world where they reinforce each other's ideas all day, but those ideas are nuts. And so in the real world, when they try to push those ideas out, people look at that and go, "That's nuts." But the Scientologists in this particular case, for example, think it's the truth. And so they think that it's really damaging and really horrible to publish this information about me that the rest of the world looks at and goes, "You guys are just trying to make him out to be a bad guy, and it's obvious." And that's the effect that they have in the real world when they're trying to go out and do all this damage. In the world of Scientology, I am evil personified, and I get that, because I used to be in that headspace. I understand exactly how they think. But in the real world, none of that matters, right? Not really. And at the end of the day, all it did was really boost my messaging.
Yeah.
So you went even farther with your messaging, and that you went and got basically an education in what happened to you. So
Yeah.
I was thinking classmate,
Yeah.
or classmates. You both were my classmates. That we could talk a little bit about school. We were all recently in a graduate program together, and I think that all of our research was in some way influenced by our own upbringings. We're all
Absolutely.
SGAs, second generation adults. We all are people who did grow up in cults. But I thought yours was really interesting, and it had a lot to do with tactics that Scientology used, in particular confession.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so tell me about your research. Tell me about this next step you took.
So, I entered into this program because I wanted to get some credentials and get people to take me a little more seriously when I'm talking about the psychological impact of cult influence. And so this program was put together by, Rod and Linda Dubrow Marshall and on what coercive control is, not just in a cult sphere, but through gangs and intimate partner violence and trafficking and all that. And so what I did is I took all that knowledge and decided to apply it to Scientology directly. And the counseling or that hypnosis business that I was talking about earlier with Dianetics, that's kind of rife throughout all of Scientology's counseling procedures, or what it's called auditing, and I'll just call it that now. And what my research showed is I analyzed L. Ron Hubbard's lectures. There were 5 of them that he gave where he describes in detail Scientology confessionals. Scientology has a whole body of methods all centered around the subject of confessionals. And normally, when you use that word, people think about a Catholic confessional. But what I want you to think about in this context is that it's really akin more to a brutal police interrogation. What they do to you in Scientology is basically parallels all the techniques and methods that are used by police officers when they are interrogating suspects of crimes. And that's the hot seat you are put in as a Scientologist every time you go into one of the closed door confessional sessions that are mandatory throughout your Scientology experience. And that's what I researched.
It's fascinating. Also, it was enough for us to experience coercion in real time. We wanted more coercion study. It's kind of funny, right? It attests to like how eager we are for this. It really equips us
Oh,
some sense.
beyond.
But yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think so very much. You have got to get to a place where you understand what happened to you if you ever expect to recover from it. And that doesn't mean everybody has to go do a master's program, but you got to get some of the details of what this stuff is all about. Otherwise, you're just going to go join another damn cult, because it is preventable if people could understand the components of what coercion is and how this stuff works. And we can take measures and do things to lessen the impact of this across not just religion, but business and sports and social movements. And I mean, this kind of stuff happens all over the place.
No, I agree. Like knowing about these methods of controls that are used, whether it's a cult, whether it's just a one-on-one controlling relationship, whether it's a gang, just knowing the methods of control that people use is so helpful to making sure that doesn't happen to you again, because you can recognize
Exactly.
it.
The thing that this program really drove home to me is sort of the inherent nature of the leader follower dynamic and the fact that that's going to happen no matter what. So, how do you have it take place without it becoming an abusive situation? And that's really where we're kind of trying to draw lines when we talk about coercive control. Because control gets a bad rap, but there's nothing wrong with controlling people. You got to do it all the time. But the context in which it happens and the considerations of it and the reasons for it and all of that, that's what we got to pay a lot more attention to.
No, that's so true. I mean, you can't avoid hierarchies. Like, that's
Right.
how companies work, that's how schools work.
That's right.
Like, you have to have the teacher keep control of the class. So you can't do
Exactly.
away with that altogether. You have to look closer at it and see how do you keep people from taking advantage, and how do you keep it from, in my opinion, becoming a human rights issue.
Exactly. Exactly.
It's kind of like how we studied and talked about this sort of spectrum of
Yep.
influence and how influence can go from benign to healthy influence. You learn mathematics in class when you're young, that can still be a form of influence, to indoctrination, to totalitarianism. There's
Exactly.
this whole spectrum of influence, and not all of it is malicious in nature. But
Exactly.
yeah,
And how organic the process can be, how people will assume,
yeah,
oh, a Jim Jones or an L. Ron
yeah.
Hubbard or a David Koresh they always had this
It's
vision
that
of
power
becoming like
dynamic.
this kind of God
Yeah, it's
figure or
that power
something.
dynamic.
And you kind of realize when you dive into the
Yeah,
details of how this stuff actually works, it's really more of a matter of an unfortunate series of events. It really isn't just this like evil, nefarious kind of thing. It's kind of like the followers have something to do with this too, right? It's
right.
not just all on the leader, and the dynamics of it and figuring all that out and how to deal with that. It's incredibly nuanced and complicated stuff when you get into all the layers of it. But I find it fascinating. I can't stop thinking about it or researching it or looking into it or talking about it. I just can't. It's just, I'm fascinated by this topic.
Yeah, me too. That's why we all went and got our masters in it and keep
Exactly.
talking about it. I think I'm just gonna ask one more thing. This is actually a
Yeah,
pretty big question, but and
Yeah.
then we should wrap up.
Yeah. What you
We're
got?
talking about unhealthy groups and how hierarchies can go bad, and we've kind of been talking about that in the
yeah.
abstract. And I was wondering, and this question is for both of you, Chris and Ashlyn. Let's talk about red flags.
Oh,
Let's say
yeah.
somebody's sitting here saying, okay, I like my book group, but they're a little pushy. Is this an unhealthy group? Should I be worried? Or is this just kind of the way things go? So give me your thoughts on that.
One of the biggest things that I tell people is consider what would happen if you were to try to leave. Would there be ramifications to you leaving, to you changing your mind, to you saying, oh, I just don't have time for this in my life right now. Like, I need to pursue other things or other relationships. If that is something that would cause a lot of controversy, conflict, if you've seen others in your group who've tried to leave and sort of the implications and results of that, and sort of this undiscussed loyalty perhaps amongst the group, that can be one of the biggest red flags. Because sometimes when we're in something, it's hard for us to be introspective because we're too close to the situation. But if you can think about what would be any consequences, ramifications to me leaving this? What would that mean for my relationships with people and within the group? That could be pretty eye opening. And so that's kind of my biggest red flag takeaway
Yeah,
that
that's
I
a
can
good
offer.
one.
Mine would be a suggestion or a red flag, I think, would be asking yourself or looking at who or what can you not criticize, ridicule, or laugh at. Because if there's anybody or any influence in a person's life that is beyond reproach, can't be criticized, can never do wrong, I'd say there's probably a really, really good chance that there's some kind of imbalance there, at least.
Yeah, true.
That's what I'll throw out there.
Yeah, and I also want to emphasize this goes beyond religious organizations. We talk about cults and people's faith. And personally, I don't really care what people's spiritual beliefs are. Like, that's totally fine. Like, go for it. But when it gets to an abusive extent, and unfortunately, this has happened in groups that revolve around a certain faith, that's where the problem is. So, although, most of our interviews and a lot of our discussions do refer to groups that do have to do with religion or spirituality, this is
Hmm.
something that can happen in so many other contexts.
I'll tell you what, if you really want to have a little surprise, I guess a lot of people are surprised by this. Martial arts dojos
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me.
happens all the time
Yeah,
in that
no, I'm
world,
sure.
all the time. Sports clubs, infamously, there's a famous story about an acting class in New York. The acting teacher had a group of people under his control, under his spell for like 12 years
That's
as an
crazy.
acting coach. It can happen in any context. It really can. It's people and their relationships. That's right.
It's that power dynamic.
That's right.
Yeah, it's that
That's
power
right.
dynamic.
Or
Yeah.
an abusive relationships, another way to put it, because it can
Yeah,
be
one on one.
one-on-one, it can be
Yeah,
groups. It's all about that dynamic between the leader and the followers, and we have to stress the codependency of it. It's not all one or the other. A cult leader all by himself is just a dude. It's just a woman. It's just
yeah.
somebody. You
With
know,
maybe a personality disorder or
that's right.
something, or
Or a series of them.
mental
That's
health
right.
issues. Yeah,
That's right. Well, it's all about the emotional needs, and that's really where my work has gone in the direction of, in terms of the stuff I talk about, is really hitting on that hard, because all of us have them and they're unavoidable and they're not a bug. They're a feature. It's what we are. So they are so easy to take advantage of. And that's, again, where that education comes in. It's like, oh, I have emotional needs? That's a very surprising thing to a lot of people, and it shouldn't be, because that's how
Yeah.
you get controlled, is people take advantage of your emotional needs.
Right. Well,
So,
Chris, you have been
good
well,
stuff.
you have been illuminating to hear from, and I appreciate
Awesome.
you sharing your story. And
Thank you.
you have a lot of strength through going through what you did. And I love that how you reclaimed your autonomy, so to speak, by sort of owning the hateful backlash and the things that Scientology was doing against you. I love that you took that narrative back into your own hands. So I'm happy that you interviewed today, so thank you very much.
Yeah, well, thanks again for having me on. I always enjoy telling my story, and I just want to do my part now to push back on this crazy world that I was part of for almost 30 years, where I had a negative impact on a lot of people's lives, and now I get to have an extremely positive effect on people's lives, and that's a lot more fun,
Right?
you know?
It is.
Yeah.
It's a lot more fun. That's a good way to
So,
put it.
Well, thank you both for being involved in this discussion. Thanks again for your time, both of you. Unless there's anything else either of you want to say.
No, I think I'm good. But
um,
Chris,
well, obviously, let me pimp the fact that I got a YouTube channel and I got a book.
What's your book called?
It's called Scientology A to Xenu,
A to
an
Z.
Ooh, I
insider's
like
guide
it.
to
I
what
love that.
Scientology is really all about.
That's
Yeah.
catchy. Great. Well, thanks again, you guys.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
And that was the show for today. Thank you for listening. Next time, we'll be chatting with someone who grew up in the group that was known as the Children of God. Generation Cult is hosted and produced by me, Dhyana Levy, with co-hosting by Ashlen Hilliard, editing assistance by Will Rogers, original music by Leanne Dunn, and opening and closing music by the band The Chaw.